So this video, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Zbrush workflow. I'm not going to go into specifics of a lot of things. I can follow up with you guys later on any particulars you need for your character. Like, I'm not going to go from the very beginning to the very ending. I'll talk a little bit about the pipeline and how this character needs to be prepared for the pipeline, but we're not going to go through that for this part, because what we really need to worry about is the workflow inside of Zbrush before we start worrying about taking it out of Zbrush and bringing it into Maya. So the great thing about doing this, let me go ahead and pause for a second. So the great thing of doing it this way is that the main difference I make between making a character in Zbrush or Mudbox and then just modeling it completely in Maya is that where we start worrying about topology. When I'm working in Zbrush, the great thing about Zbrush is that I don't really have to think about the topology. I have to consider it to some degree, but I can start exploring shapes and form and the look of my model before I even have to start worrying about the technical components. Like, does it have edge loops in this location so I can extrude a leg? Does it have quads or not? So in Zbrush, I can just get into using my sculpting brushes and have a very artistic approach to this. Whereas if I modeled in Maya, I would use like a box modeling technique. Let me go ahead and show some example. So if I'm taking a modeling approach, a polygonal modeling approach to this, what I'm doing is I'm working within my 3D package like Blender or Maya or 3ds Max, and I am essentially modifying the geometry of my model by cutting and adding new edge loops and polygons, and dividing polygons and redirecting the flow of my topology in order to get the shape I want. So it's very much like a rough to fine. I mean, both approaches are rough to fine, but this one, the main difference is we have to think about our edge loops here, because the only way we can add a new feature like making, let's say, ears, is I actually have to have the geometry and topology there to do so. And so over time, right, this starts to look really clean. And the advantage of this is, one, I don't have to worry about some kind of cleanup approach that you would have to worry about with a sculpting workflow. And then two, you get to really control your topology and think about it as you're going along. So compare that to something like this, right? So here's just like a breakdown of this 3D character from Flips Normals. And so the idea here is you do this like really rough clay sculpt. You don't really think about the topology that much. You just add more geometry, use your sculpting brushes to add details, and then we're not thinking about topology here, but what we do is after we get to kind of this stage and we're ready to bring it into our other program, we go into something like Maya, and then we actually draw the topology on top of the model, because we need to make a low poly version of our character that will essentially be easy and like cheap enough and small enough, or low resource cost enough inside of Maya that our team and our animation can let this, like, use this and not like have their computer die. And then what we do is we bake the detail difference between the high res and this low res retopologized version so that we can capture all the detail we made in Zbrush. So that's the basic kind of difference. Is we don't worry about the topology until more or less after we're done sculpting. That's not necessarily always true. Like, there is a point in the when you're working on this that's a good idea to go ahead and do the retopologizing for your Zbrush character like midway, just because, even though Zbrush doesn't worry too much about your topology for the most part, it still cares to some degree. If your topology is like really funky, like you have a pole in a certain spot, certain brushes are going to react kind of different than if you had quads. So that's the basic difference between the workflow. So I'm here pretending that, or assuming that I am going to be doing the character in Zbrush, and then I'm going to take it into Maya later to retopologize. All that to be said, you can jump back and forth. Like, there's no reason you have to do it either one way or the other way, right? You could do most of your modeling, like let's say get to 50% of your model, like get all the big shapes and details and topology inside of Maya, and then you can import it into here, right? Or you can start in Zbrush and do like the basic shape blockout, merge a piece together, and then bring it into Maya before you're done doing all your detail. So there's not really a set in stone, like you have to do one or the other. It's just being aware of why you'll pick up why you want to do one way or the other. Okay, so I have several subtools loaded from a previous project, and I'll talk a little bit about some interface stuff in a second. But so I'm just kind of showing you the work process. So the first process is blocking in with primitives. So this is just kind of dropping in, almost all of these are just spheres, and then I just use the move tool. So it's the moving brush, so essentially lets you move stuff, and I'll talk about brushes in a second. And then maybe a couple sculpting brushes to refine certain shapes and edges. And then just kind of blocking out my main forms and my main shapes. So in this case, I'm doing a human character. I'm kind of like getting a simplified anatomy. And then what I do is I kind of merge it all together, and then I start to refine certain shapes, hit certain landmarks, right? Like the wing of the pelvis, line of the rib cage, and then I keep refining it by, so you can see here I kind of simplify a little bit more, make it a little bit more stylized. Actually, I don't know which one of these came first, to be completely honest. So that's the first stage, is just kind of blocking out the shapes. It's a lot easier if you have multiple simple geometries, so you kind of break your model down into like different forms, and the more forms you break it down to, the more volumetric and dimensional your character is going to be. You don't want to really go crazy. You can see I didn't go super crazy, but I'm really just kind of trying to get the basic shapes right. So I'm thinking of the rib cage, I'm thinking of what its basic shape is going to be. It's not just a sphere, right? It has like planes to it, right? There's like an edge here and an edge here, so it's a flat plane here and a flat plane here, right? The head is just not a sphere, right? It started as a sphere, and then I extruded out a part, and then I kind of made like a cut in for where the eyes are going to be, and I even dropped in like a nose and a bridge kind of form, and then plopped in the ears as separate objects because it's way easier just to add a new object, and et cetera, throughout the entire model. Okay, and then once you get to around there, then what you want to do is you start to refine it, right? So I've just took literally this shape right here, I think is this one right here, and I just started adding more features, right? So sculpting in the nose, right? And it started out like this, right? Started out, and I was working symmetrically, right? So I'm starting out the character symmetrically with that merged mesh. A couple times I'll redo my topology or remesh my model so that I can get more details. So like the eyes, I dropped in some spheres, I cut out some holes for the eyelids, and then also doing the nose and mouth, and then I just remeshed the model so that it wasn't super bad. And we'll take a look at that in a second. You can see I even did like a block in for the hair. I just like took a couple masses of geometry, and then I just started welding them together and then using a brush to clean them up. And then I put in this case, I put in the expression pretty early on. I had to redistribute her proportions, which was really easy to do. That's probably one of the easier things you can do in the sculpting process, is just changing up the proportions. And then, each week I would like kind of refine it further, right? So the face changed just very subtly, but enough to make it like appealing. Okay, somewhere around here I added some extra detail, so you can see the hands are kind of still goofy, and then the feet aren't really anything. Were my simple feet that I created in the initial block out. And then you can see after I added more detail to these. And I'm adding completely new geometry. Like I modeled these separately and attached them to the leg. Once you get comfortable with the workflow, this is actually pretty easy to just cut off a part of the model, add a new part of it, and restitch it together. But that workflow is particular. You can lose detail. You can accidentally like weld fingers together. So it takes a little practice, but you can get it. Then I started blocking out the hair and the clothes, right? So I started to get the details. You can see these are very basic geometry, right? So if I bring this down, actually, technically, I think some of these I modeled in Maya, right? And some of these I just retopologized in Zbrush really quickly. Retopologizing Zbrush is pretty good for anything that's not going to be deforming, like your character's skin, right? You wouldn't want to use the retopologizing tools in Zbrush for your character, just because it's kind of hard to control. But if there's something that's not going to move, like let's say this staff right here, this is just like a quick block out. I don't really have to think about the topology for that because it's not going to bend. So you can let the retopologizing tools get you a lower poly mesh pretty easily. And then from there, it's just cleaning up and making it look nicer and nicer, right? So around here is where, it starts to feel like the character is almost complete. In this case, you're not going to be posing it. I was posing it to show, this is more of like an art sculpt and less of like an actual model. that I would use in animation. But if I was doing it in animation, you know, I wouldn't give it an expression, right? And I wouldn't make the character asymmetrical like I do here, right? So she's very asymmetrical here. And so that just makes it harder for me later on. And if I look at the model, you can see, it's, okay, there it goes. So you can see around here, I did actually retopologize it pretty early on. So around week 4, I actually did retopo it just because I wanted to control the topology and get that figured out early on. But there's a lot of places where, you know, I actually had to redo it, right? So you can see here, the topology is pretty good. And actually, there's a really good chance that I just use Z remesher. I think I did. So this is just the remeshing tool inside of Maya, or Zbrush. So it has its problems. I mean, it does a pretty good job, but it has its problems. Like there's weird pulls in different locations. The eyelids are kind of funky, right? See, there's like a little weird kind of part right there, but it's good for just like making your mesh like reshaped a little bit so it's easier to sculpt on. And then right around, so I thought I did it really early on, but I guess I didn't. So right around here is probably where I was, nope, not there. It must have been here. There we go. All right, so now I actually had a retopoed mesh. So around here is where I actually really paid attention to my topology and how my how my edge loops laid out. You can see I spent a lot more time on a lot of these pieces. And I did that part before I did the posing. So yeah. So that's the basic workflow. Is we want to go ahead and start from like some primitive shapes, or if you did a block out in Maya, that's totally cool too. You just want to import that in as an object, and then we start sculpting. So let me go ahead and move on to the next part. Okay, so we want to first have a pretty good layout and tool setup. I have this particular layout because it works really well for me. Some things are being blocked by this bar at the bottom of the video. Don't worry about that. But for the most part, this is the layout I like. I have a lot of buttons I took out of the subtool menu. So all my different like tools and operations I put on my interface. If you want this kind of thing, you should be able to find it. If you go to the modeling resources, there's ZBrush files. And right here, I have instructions. So I won't go into detail because I go into detail here. But the main idea is that you download this folder, you can put it in your installation location for your ZBrush, and then you can load in my layout, which is this right here, my custom layout, and then also load in my hotkeys if you want to use them too. It also has custom brushes and custom materials as well. So I set up this layout, and it has, essentially I just kind of arranged it in a way I like it, and I have a lot of the main, kind of the most frequently used operations here. And I also have hotkeys for my brushes. So it's blocking it down here, but I have these different, like obviously these are all the brushes I have. Some of these are imported, and I actually have some of these set to numbers on my keyboard. So if I come over here, normally if you want to load in a brush or quickly select a brush, like let's say I want the standard brush, I press B for brush, S for standard, and then it gives me all the S ones, and then I would figure out what the letter for standard is. So let's see, standard is U. So in this case, I would do BSU. So once you kind of get used to that, if I go to a different brush, I can always press BSU really quickly, and now I'm standard. But I like to use hotkeys with my most frequently ones, because I rarely use anything besides these ones. One is my first hotkey, and that's going to be my standard brush. So I'm just going to kind of show you guys what these are. So standard brush, the way it works is it essentially draws on your mesh. And so wherever you draw, it essentially raises the surface up raises the surface up like kind of like a hill, right? Let me go ahead and increase the Z intensity. All right, so it's just increasing it like a hill, right? And if you go over the same part, it's going to keep building up and building up and building up, right? So you can see over here, it's getting larger and larger and larger. So the standard brush is really good for like drawing things, right? So just laying in some quick shapes, right? So you can do something like that. And so it's really good for just drawing in like essentially a line on the surface. What's important is holding Alt on my keyboard. You'll see my cursor has a minus next to it now, right? So that's going to subtract. So this is just the subtraction of the standard brush. Most brushes just if they push out or pull out, the opposite, if you hold Alt, is just going to push in. You can also change its behavior by default Z add. So when I draw, I can just make its default to push in, or the opposite of the Z add. So it's going to Z subtract. Okay. Down here is the intensity. This is how much it performs its operation. So, right, the higher it is, the more the surface is pulling up. Right, the lower it is, the less. It's like more of a gentle effect. Which is really important. Focal shift, I wouldn't really mess around with focal shift. You can't see it right here, but down below here is focal shift. Focal shift is essentially going to be a fall off from the center of your brush to the edge of your brush. So don't worry about it too much. You also have to be careful. Sometimes you'll start accidentally drawing in the color channel, right? So if let's go ahead and show the paint on this. If I'm drawing here, let's go ahead and make sure this is all cleared out, right? So I might actually poly paint, and it's really not the end of the world, especially since you're not worrying about color right now. But sometimes you might want to turn that off. And you can also paint materials. So try not to paint materials, just only paint or use your Z add. So just make sure these are off. These by default. I'm not going to go into where everything is by default. I'll try to mention it, but that's just going to slow me down too much. Okay. Alrighty. So let's move on to the next brush. This was the standard brush, and then probably the most commonly used brush is the move brush. So the move brush is going to be exactly what it sounds like. It's going to move your object, right? And so let's go ahead and let's say yes. Okay. So essentially it's going to grab your mesh and you're going to drag it around. And by default, it's dragging it like perpendicular to your camera. So if I'm looking at this angle, if I drag to the right, it's going to kind of pull out in this direction perpendicular to my camera. But if I look over here and I drag to the right now, it pulled backwards because I'm looking from this direction. Okay. It's pretty straightforward. The move brush is probably like the most commonly used brush, right? This is where I'm going to change things. Like let's say for the arms, I want them to be like shaped slightly differently. Maybe I want them to be a little bit bigger, right? So I mean, I can just drag them drag the pieces apart, or not the pieces apart, but the sides apart to kind of stretch it larger, right? I can use other brushes, of course, but sometimes the move brush is just the fastest way to do it. It's really good for just like reshaping things, right? So if I want to make, like, let's say I want to make the thighs a lot thicker, maybe right around there, or maybe the calves. I think they're the calves. Yeah, I'm pretty sure those are called calves, right? So I can just really quickly do that with a move brush. It's really based on the topology, right? How like smoothly it moves. And so if you have like a really high resolution mesh, right, it's going to go slow and you're going to get this like weird artifacting on it. But if it's a lower resolution mesh, right, it has a smoother fall off, and it's like a lot easier to move around. One trick with the move brush is if you hold Alt, it will actually move the geometry based on the normal of your surface. So it kind of pushes off the surface rather than moves it based on the camera. So if I wanted to kind of pull these cheeks out, right, I could hold Alt on the cheek and pull that out, and it's going to start pulling that shape out instead of me having to like get into the right pose or position, so I can drag it to the left or right. Okay. Let's see. The next brush is going to be the clay brush. Let's turn off RGB. So the way the clay brush works is that it's kind of like, let's go ahead and increase the Z intensity. It's kind of like the Z add brush or the standard brush, but what it does is it kind of, let me go ahead and do this on a sphere. And let's go ahead, I'm going to add a few subdivision levels, and I have to probably make this, there we go, editable. All right, so here's the standard brush. Here is the move brush. Let me make this a little bit darker, and let's do basic material. There we go. All right. So clay brush is essentially going to build up like a plateau, but what's cool about the clay brush is it also starts by trying to fill in gaps. So you see how to cut here? I can use that, when I use that clay brush, it kind of tries to fill in the gaps first. If I use a standard brush, you can see it kind of draws and adds over all areas at the same time, regardless of what their surface height is. So the clay brush is really cool for just kind of like cleaning up areas, and I can smooth it back out, so I can kind of like flatten my surface. Okay, and then of course the opposite is just pushing into the surface like that. So it's good for a really big form buildup, and that leads us into the clay buildup. It's very similar to the clay brush, but it has like a really hard alpha to it. So draws in these shapes, and it has a really strong kind of build up. So if this is really nice for if you want to build up mass or volumes on the mesh really quickly. So if I wanted to do like a muscle, right? Like let's say this is like the trapezius, or the deltoid on the arm, right? Let's actually do this on the character, right? So I'm gonna hide that. Actually, let's go to this one, right? So if I wanted to build up like a muscle right here, I can just kind of use this to kind of build that mass up, right? And you really want to go like kind of rough at first. You don't want to really worry about trying to make things clean. You really just want to block in the shapes and get the planes and forms in there, right? And then I can use, you know, the smooth brush to kind of like smooth that in. And if I wanted like, you know, let's say this character had like pec muscles, right? You know, I could build that in right here. And I would use other brushes to kind of help it out, right? I wouldn't just use the clay buildup, but you can see how you can get like a really quick buildup really quickly. All right, so now the character has big chest muscles now. Here's my undo history. I can just scroll back through that. Okay, so that's the clay buildup. Same thing, Alt is just eats into the mesh. All right. Number 5 is my Damien Standard brush. The Damien Standard brush is the best brush for getting really organic cuts. So let's say I go ahead and build up those chest muscles, right? So let's go ahead and I'm just going to do this really loosely. I'm not going to worry too much about it, right? So let's say I build that up, and I want a little bit more definition here, right? So I can use that Damien Standard brush, and I can go ahead and start cutting in, right? So this is just going to kind of give you like a nice cut line. And it's also nice for its inverse, right? So let's say I do a cut line in here, and let's go up a subdivision level, right? So I'm going to go ahead and add that cut in, right? I'm gonna smooth it out maybe a little bit. And then if, let's say I wanted like a really, kind of like a sharper line right here, I can hold the inverse, the opposite, so holding Alt to do the opposite of my brush. So now it's going to actually raise out. But you can see it has like this really sharp line it creates. And so maybe the Z intensity is too high. But I can kind of come across here, right? And now I have like a sharper line there. And so I can go on both sides. And now that's like much more stylized and kind of has really clean, sharp lines. And so yeah, that's the Damien Standard, really good for drawing in things like wrinkles or carving in forms. You'll notice it has like a very organic fall off, right? So let's go ahead and bring that a little bit higher, right? So it has like a really soft fall off. And that could be compared to the Orb Crack brush. So there's a brush called the Orb Cracks, and that has a very linear hard fall off. So that's kind of good for like really, what would I call it? Hard surface things like rocks and machinery, right? Or like a panel line on a machine, like cutting that in is very inorganic, whereas the Damien Standard has a very soft fall off. That's Damien Standard. 6 is hard polish. Hard polish is really good for it. Essentially flattens the surface and gets rid of a lot of irregularities on the surface. So if I come in here and kind of run it over here, it's going to kind of polish whatever I run over. It's going to kind of flatten it first, and then everything that's kind of like caught within its web starts to kind of combine together into one plane. So if I do it right here, right, you can see that this area that I started over here starts to combine into one plane, and this over here has a plane. And so this is really nice if you want to just like, I think it's a good idea if you're doing stylized characters especially, to kind of like start to simplify your shapes into simpler planes. So let's say I would do like this area right here of the top of the pecs as kind of like its own plane, and then like on the side right here its own other plane. And obviously I'm not trying to make this perfect, but something like that. Now I have a little bit more definition rather than it just being like, look at this is just like a blobby mess right here. So you can see that on a lot of areas I've just defined planes, and I lost it. I kind of like smooth it away, right? In the end, we don't want everything to be like super rigid and sharp. So I smooth it away, but you can still see and feel those planes, and you can see that on like the rib cage, for instance. You can feel a plane here versus a plane here, and you can see where I make certain areas where I like have like a sharp edge, right, by using like Damien Standard. So if I wanted to exaggerate this right here, right, so I could exaggerate that separation from like the obliques to the rib cage, right? I can run that over and then just start smoothing things out. I'll go over that stuff in a second. And then I have other areas where I kind of lose the shape and lose the form, right? So we kind of have that plane, right? Again, just using the hard polish or something similar, using Damien standard to kind of reinforce the edges, right? Those plane transitions. And then when we're kind of done with that, we just kind of smooth it off a little bit so it's not sharp everywhere. So like maybe I lose a shape up here, but I let it stay sharp down here. It makes your model a lot more interesting if it's not just like cut lines and hard planes everywhere, right? We have some areas where we lose the shape, and then we have other areas where we kind of reinforce the shape. So that like lost and found makes a lot of people's models like really interesting. It makes them like more appealing and just better than just if they just made everything perfect. Okay, the next brush is going to be the Trim Dynamic brush. So the Trim Dynamic brush, this is 7 on my keyboard, is going to be very similar to Hard Polish brush, but it really eats away at your mesh pretty quickly. And it's also really good for breaking an edge so you have more planes. So for instance, if I came here, let's say I kind of wanted a plane along this ear right here, but I have this really sharp edge that I created by accident. So if I use the Hard Polish, it's kind of hard, right? Because if I come in here, it's kind of getting a little wiggly, right? So it like kind of wants to snap to one side or the other. But if I use the Trim Dynamic brush, I can come in here and I can start to kind of, especially if you draw it over a sharp edge, it breaks that edge into a flat plane, right? So now I have this flat plane between the front and back. And I can do the same thing on this side, right? I can just break this again, almost like beveling, right? And so now I have like a lot more dimensionality to that I can work with. So that's the basics of the Trim Dynamic brush. I don't use the inverse of Polish or Trim Dynamic, but that's pretty much it. Then the last brush I have here is the Inflate brush. So the Inflate brush is going to do exactly what it sounds like. It's going to kind of make the area bigger, right? So it's going to kind of add volume to an area. So let's say I liked the arms, but they're just too skinny and I don't really want to have to keep moving and squishing everything around. I can go ahead and use the Inflate brush to just kind of add more mass to that area. So it's really good for, like, let's say in this area, like I'd kind of separate the legs out, but the legs, you know, they don't really have a lot of volume, right? Like maybe like up here is a good example, right? You might extrude out a part, but then there's, like, in reality, like things kind of press into each other, especially like skin and flesh, right? You have parts that they're not just like going to have like a really perfect separation from each other. So you might have like a little bit of inflation so that they kind of start to press or overlap with each other a little bit, right? So I might do that on the inside of the legs, just so there's like a little bit more volume there. And yeah, back of it, maybe like back here, I want a little bit more volume. Okay, some other brushes that we might run into would be the pinch brush. So that's brush, pinch, let's see, pinch brush. So the way the pinch brush works is it's kind of like the Damien standard if I was using it to draw a line. What it does is it takes like an edge and sharpens it. I personally don't use it that much, so you can see it's going to sharpen this edge. And the reason why is because it actually moves your topology in a really weird way. And so after a while, it can make your model a little hard to work with, right? So if I come in here and I wanted to draw right here with Damien standard, it depends on the topology. So because there's no edge loops here or here, and now it's spaced out, like over here, I can get pretty easily draw a line, but right here, you know, I don't have an edge to really draw on, so it's maybe hitting the other one. So I don't really like it because of what it does with the topology. Some brushes you might also notice, actually not some brushes, actually most brushes won't do this. Another brush that's very common is snake hook, right? The snake hook is really good for like kind of stretching and pulling out a new piece. It's kind of like extrusion, but you're not, we're not really doing any extrusion, snake hook, right? So if I kind of drag on that, you'll see it essentially pulls out my surface, and it's not like the move brush, right? The move brush, you know, takes like a really large surface area with me. And also when I curve it, it kind of doesn't let go, right? It's like a linear where I started to where I end. But with that snake hook, right? Brush, snake, hook, right? When I start to move, you'll see it kind of freezes the stuff I left behind. But the problem is you'll see, you know, it can only do so much with low topology, and we would want to do like a retopology on that. Okay, so those are basic brushes. I also, you can see that starting to stretch out. So this is a good example I want to kind of talk about before I move on of why topology is still important. So right, if I come over here with my Damien standard brush, right, I can get some pretty detailed shapes over here, or like clean shapes. Like I can get some pretty low or high res stuff going on because I have enough topology. But up here, you'll see because of my topology, it's still kind of crunchy and funky. So I'll talk about this in a second, but this is where I would want to do like either a Z remesher or a Dynamesh. So if I did a GU Dynamesh, say nope, don't worry. All right, so it redistributed my polygons. We'll talk about that in a second. So now I have equal density over here and here. So it's pretty common. I mean, this is something you have to do when you're working in ZBrush if you really want to know, or kind of, unless you came in with like a model with all the topology figured out, all the forms figured out, and you're just sculpting in smaller detail, then you don't need to worry about remeshing your model. But if you're doing any type of like actual building your model and exploring forms, you're going to be remeshing your model and changing its topology on the fly really quickly and very often. Okay, but we'll talk about that in a second. So yeah, so that's the snake hook. Let me see if there's any other ones. There's all kinds of brushes. Even though I only talked about those certain brushes and they're what I like, there's a lot in here that you could really easily like work into your standard workflow, that as long as you come up with like a good reason to use it. And there's some that are like, right, for this one for example, there's a lot of brushes that like essentially has a alpha to it that adds detail and geometry. So there's brushes like that, like scales. Let's see, I don't know if there's any scale ones in here. No, I don't think so. There's like cloth brushes, so I've downloaded these Cellweek cloth brushes. So they're kind of like the standard brush, but they're really good for, this is a little too high intensity. So they're really good for like kind of building in folds, right, on the mesh. So if I come in here and I start to kind of get like a fold structure, wrinkle structure, right, it's just like has like a nicer shaping to it for kind of getting cloth, right? So you can kind of see how that feels a little bit like a fold on a t-shirt. Maybe if I did a better job of it, maybe you'd feel that it would look like that. But yeah, so there's all kinds of great brushes out there. So I definitely encourage you guys to kind of play around with them. But yeah, let me go ahead and start talking about workflow next. So that's the basics of brushes and brush settings. So actually, you know what? Before we move that, let's talk about the other brushes. So like I said, I'm not going to go into detail on everything, so I'm not going to go into like controls too much, but we have our basic brushes, and we also need to get used to our masking brushes. So that's holding control. Masking is used for a lot of things, right? You can use mask to define a polygroup, right? So if I set a polygroup, what's nice about a polygroup is you can easily select an area, right, and isolate it or mask it off. Or let's say I wanted that to be masked off so I can go across and, you know, build up on the eyebrows, right? So now I can build the eyebrow shape or ridge over, and right now I have that shape kind of masked out, and that makes it really easy to select that, and then I can clear that mask. So, you know, it's good to get used to, you know, drawing your mask by holding Control Alt to erase your mask, holding Control and dragging off your model to clear your mask, holding Control and tapping on the canvas to inverse your mask, and then holding Control and tapping on the mesh, and Control Alt and tapping on the mesh to smooth and sharpen your mesh. But again, I don't want to go into the details on this. Please make sure you guys watch like a ZBrush Essentials video to kind of get this. And I just reminder to, if you ever forget a button, just come down here and you can find it. One of the nice things about ZBrush 2 is you can hold Control and hover over almost anything, and it'll tell you what that thing does. So if you ever look at a button and you're like, what does that button do? Just go ahead and you know, hold Control, and it will give you an information about it. Okay, so it's masking. Smoothing is obviously really important. Let me go ahead and step this back before I did those stupid looking horns. Here we go. So smoothing is just holding Shift, right? And so smoothing is just going to blur our details. So if we have really sharp surfaces, so let's say I draw that out and it's very uneven, right? I can hold Shift and start to kind of smooth that out and erase the detail. It really depends on what subdivision level you're at, right? So if I come up to like a really high subdivision level, right, you'll see that smooth brush is having a very little effect. But then if I jump down to like subdivision 3, you can see it has a huge effect. So keep that in mind, is that, you know, when you're working, you want to keep the subdivision levels if you can, just because you're going to have way more control and it's going to be easy to clean your mesh up. Some people like to do like a workflow where you just are only working in one subdivision level with a certain amount of geometry. That's totally fine too. But personally, when I work, I like try to keep subdivision levels so I can jump back and forth between low poly and high poly, just because certain things, you know, when I want to like perfect forms or make something like really clean, right? I'm coming up to my high poly, higher subdivision levels, right? Let's, I think that would be in stroke. It doesn't matter. Let's pretend that it's perfect, right? So, right. So I might like make really clean shapes at high poly or higher subdivision level. But if I want to change, like, let's say, the size of my character's head really quickly, you know, I'd go down to low poly model or low subdivision level, just because, you know, it's way easier for me to like adjust the proportions and shape, or smooth something out and get rid of certain details, right? All right, and then the last type of brush is holding Control Shift. So it's Control Mask, Shift Smooth. Control Shift is hiding and showing, right? And so you can have select rectangle. There's also select lasso if you want to like do something like that. And you just Control Shift tap to bring everything back, or Control Shift drag off the mesh to inverse my selection. So it's really nice to kind of focus in and hone in on my what I'm looking at. So those are the brushes. Let's go ahead and talk about workflow. So when I'm working, the way I work is I would start with something like this, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at the subtool menu. So you have your tool menu. This is like essentially you can think of almost like the ZBrush project is like the Maya scene, right? It's your whole scene with all of your stuff in it, right? You can have multiple models. You can have undo history. You can have stuff saved, like camera settings, things like that. This over here is your tool palette. So your tool palette is kind of like a grouping of objects. You can think of it like a folder or a group within Maya, right? So it has like a collection of models or pieces of a model, right? And then you have your subtool palette, which is all this stuff down here. So the subtool palette, or actually all this stuff down here is technically under the tool palette, but you have your subtool palette, and this is essentially within your group, and so you might have multiple objects. So usually what I would have is, I'm just gonna split this. I combine this together, but let's do split to similar parts. Yeah, okay. So you can see all these are separate objects, right? And what I did was I would just, let's say I had a character with horns, right? I just like inserted a basic sphere, right? I put it into position. Right, I went ahead and checked its topology, and we'll talk about retopology in a second. So this is decent enough, right? And then I would use like my brushes, right? I'd start using like maybe my move brush, or I would use that's actually kind of a cool shape. Or I would use like that snake hook to change the shape, right? And then I would do something like mirroring, right? Which I can do by going down to geometry, and doing modify topology, mirror and weld, right? Which essentially duplicates my mesh. Or I can just maybe go up here and duplicate my geometry and then flip it by going to, I think it's under, some of these things are just so dumb where they are, if you ask me. And I actually have them over here. You have mirror and flip. So this is just going to flip the model. So I just took that duplicated version and flipped it over. And so yeah, I have these on here, and I have a widescreen format, so maybe this configuration doesn't work great for your setup because some of these things might be off camera. But I recommend you guys check out a video on how to like modify your configuration. And then if I wanted to edit both of them at the same time, right? These are actually different subtools, right? So you can see this one right here is its own subtool, and this one's its own subtool. And so, you know, that's how I kind of did this breakout, right? Is I kind of made every major shape like its own out of like a sphere or sometimes a cube. And then I just kind of moved it, shaped it into what I liked. And then later on I merged it together. So yeah, so if I wanted to make a mirrored object, I could do that geometry modify topology to duplicate it and weld it back into the same object. So I duplicated it, flipped it, and made it one object. Or I could do what I did here, where I just took my subtool and I duplicated it. So I duplicated it, and then I went down to that deformation tab and flip it, or click mirror, because that just mirrors across. And then what I could do is, this is under the transform tool, there is activate symmetry. but I also have it up here, right here. And if all you have to do is press X on your keyboard to turn on and off symmetry. And so I'm doing X symmetry, so you can see I'm moving. Let's go. Oh, they're separate objects. So in this case, I want to go ahead and combine them together. You can merge down, so merge them into one object, right? And so let's go turn on symmetry, and so now I can modify them at the same time, just like I would in Maya if I turned on symmetry. Okay, and I can do symmetry in different axes, right? Y-axis or Z-axis, but it's not symmetrical in the Z-axis, so there's nothing over there. Okay, so let's go ahead and move down. So we have all these different objects, and we can isolate them. Like if I want to only look at this object, I can click on the solo button, which I think is under also the transform menu if you can't find it, right here. So just click on solo. You can see it's just going to solo my object. If you need to focus on it, it's kind of like isolate selection in Maya. You can also hide different subtools, right? So I could hide the horns if I wanted to. If you have it selected, it's going to show it, right? So I have that little eyeball, and I have it selected. So even though it's hidden technically, I have it selected so I can see it. But when I click off of it, I can't see it. And so if I'm sculpting, you know, I have to be on the active subtool. I have to like click on that object to sculpt on it. So if I clicked on that, if I'm clicking here, I'm not affecting anything up here because I'm selecting the arms. I also have everything actually separated. We can put things in folders. So if you look down, I also don't, oh, this is visibility sets. Don't worry about that. That's a new feature. All right, so you can see on my more final character, right? You can see I have everything in different folders, right? So I have her hair pieces in a separate folder. I have her clothes in a separate folder. I have like her extra face components in a separate folder, etc. So you can do that by just adding a new folder, dragging and dropping stuff in there. Okay. Let's go back to here. All right. So let's talk next about topology. So down here, if you need to, for any reason, change your geometry, we have, let's go ahead and I'm going to go to this object here. And I'm going to go ahead and if you ever want to look at your topology, just click on this polyframe button and it's going to show your topology. So I'm going to go ahead and insert. So we'll go insert another sphere. And let's say I'm going to scale it down. So let's say I want to kind of like reshape this, but it kind of is really high poly. You can see I'm getting kind of like ugly shapes here, which isn't great. So what I could do, if you want to make your topology like nice and clean, but two, also control how many polygons you have, you can use this Z remesher button right here, which is under geometry. And when you click on Z remesher, it's going to use this target poly count button to remodel this and keep its shape as best as it can, and then use this as how many polygons it's going to have. So you can see up here, it's kind of going through. You can press escape if it's taking too long or you made a mistake. Let's just wait for it to end. And there you go. So now I have this beautiful topology. It's way more manageable. This is going to be easy for me to manipulate and change, right? If I had used a higher poly count, right, and I did Z remesher, it's going to have more polygons, right? So higher Z remesher. See that? I have right here, it might be in a different area, but you can see how many polygons you currently have. Don't worry about the poly count too much, except for you don't really want to go higher than like 1 million if you're on a laptop. My computer maybe can go up to 16 million, but you guys definitely, if you're working on a laptop, don't want to get up to 1 million or more than 1 million if you can help it. So anyways, so that's how we would remesh it, right? So that's just the basic way of remeshing it, and it usually gives you really friendly topology, right? So it gives you like quadded topology, and so it's kind of something that's almost, you could bring it into Maya pretty easily as long as it's low poly enough, and you can do some pretty cool things. But it's still really dependent, like as mentioned before, like topology is affected, or your brushes are affected by topology. So you can see I'm smoothing this out, but that little pole area right there is like having a hard time. So that can, it's a thing to keep in mind. The other type of retopologizing I have in here is the Dynamesh. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take this model, and I'm gonna merge them together, just to show you guys. So the Dynamesh is really used for when you're going to, well, you can use it just to remesh your model really quickly, just like Z remesher. this button right here. But it's also, what's really useful about it is it welds objects together where they're intersect. It's kind of like a Boolean operation, if you know what those are. So it's going to be based on this resolution. And if I click on Dynamesh, you can see now those are stitched together. So where all that stuff that was inside is now gone. And now I have one mesh that is combined together. So it's really helpful for like that stage once you're like blocked out your character and you want to start combining certain pieces together, then you can do so. Let's say I was making a character who had armor pieces, like it had a chest plate and shoulder plates and like gauntlets, right? I don't want to Dynamesh those together. So keep that in mind. This is like, you know, this character, her wrist and her fingers are supposed to be one piece, right? They're supposed to be like skin connected together. So I do want to, you know, actually merge these together with that Dynamesh, right? Let me just show you really quickly. Let's go ahead and get those hands merged down. And then I'd come down here to my geometry tab, and then I'd click on Dynamesh, right? And so there you go, it merged together. You can see it kind of has a problem there. That's not great. So you probably use a higher resolution, right? So if you use a higher resolution, right, it's going to keep a lot more of that shape, and it's the lower the resolution is, obviously, the more rough that is. The more you're going to lose your shape if you click on this polish button. If you don't click on this polish button, it doesn't do that. And then also the smaller the distance for welding. You can see here, if at this distance, you know, these fingers that are close together start to weld together, which isn't great. So you might, if you do Dynamesh, you probably want to use a higher Dynamesh level or resolution. Okay, so and then I'd come in here and I'd start, maybe that's a little too high. So let's go ahead and jump that back a second. Let's set that maybe to 200 Dynamesh. All right, and then I would come through and start smoothing and cleaning certain things up. All right, so that is the basics of the Dynamesh and Z remeshing. They're pretty straightforward. So the next thing I would probably do is I have to show you guys the subdivision levels. So subdivision levels are found under the geometry. Your mesh by default, you can see right here, these are all grayed out because there's no higher subdivision level. If I click on divide, you'll see now I have subdivision levels. So essentially it's going to, you know, should quadruple your model to polygons. So it's going to quadruple them, or not quadruple them. And I can jump back and forth between these subdivision levels. Then I can click on divide again to go higher, and I can go up and down. The hotkeys, it's good to get used to the hotkeys. I think it says, should have hopefully it has the hotkeys here. Oh, I don't know. All right, so anyways, D is to go up a subdivision level, Shift D is go down, and Control D is to add a subdivision level. So if I'm at the highest subdivision level, I'm pressing D to go up a subdivision level, and I press Control D, it's going to go up another subdivision level, or create a new one. So I have more resolution. You can see now I'm at like about 4 million. And then I can press Shift D to go down, and then D to go back up. So it's great to like kind of get your model to like a good state, like a good, fairly low poly version of it, and then just add some subdivision levels so you can start sculpting in your detail, right? So, you know, I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just sculpting shapes, right? And then I can, you know, go down a subdivision level and start cleaning things up, and yeah, it has like a nice interplay. That's the way you're going to be able to like make a really clean and efficient model. Okay. So the basic workflow is, you know, you either bring in your proxy modeled character, and then if I brought in like a low poly model, right? Let's say, I don't know if I can go lower. Let's say this is what I blocked in. Actually, this is pretty high poly, but let's say this is I blocked in Maya, and they didn't have this many. Let's say it had less polygons. I could just come in here and add a few more polygons and just start sculpting, right? I can start making more refined shapes, cleaning it up. And if it is already stitched together, like I actually have all my topology figured out, I'm pretty good to go. All I have to do is add subdivision levels. I don't have to worry about any of that Dynameshing or Z-remeshing, right? But let's say I'm making my character inside of Zbrush. What I would do is that workflow is, let's go up to, actually this one's probably the best I could do. So let's say I want to go ahead and combine these pieces together. I start with primitives, I block out the shape, all the forms are looking good, like I have the volumes, the basic volumes and shapes I want. Now I want to weld them together. So by welding them together, I'd have to do Dynamesh, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and set this to about 200. But before I do that, what I want to do, and this is really important, if you're going to be working in Zbrush, it's a good idea to kind of, there's ways in Zbrush you can destroy your work, right? In a lot of cases, you want to do it just because that's part of the workflow. But I think it's a good idea to make backups as you're going along. So for instance, before I Dynamesh, because Dynamesh kind of gets rid of all my subdivision levels, it changes my topology, I'm going to lose detail, right? I'm going to duplicate my mesh. So I duplicate my mesh, so this is the old one, and let's go ahead and I'll just rename it, and I'll say old, and then I'll just hide it. Okay, so I'll come back here, and now I can Dynamesh it, because I have that backup, so that's really good. So I'm going to come down here, geometry, I want to click on Dynamesh, and it says, do you have multiple subdivisions? Do you want to freeze? Nope. And so I want to get a different level, because that's not great right there. So I need a higher resolution. Nope. Okay, and I would want to do this kind of until I can get to where it's going to not do that. And in this case, sometimes what you might want to do, if you want to do that Dynameshing, but it's like you have to go super high on that, you might want to actually move some things apart. You can see my character's kind of in an A pose, so the main major limbs aren't like really intersecting, because if I did, then when I Dynamesh, they would kind of combine together. So once I've Dynameshed it, that's nice, right? All my polygons, they stitch together, all my objects stitch together, and then I have like evenly spaced polygons, right? There's no areas with big stretched out polygons and dense polygons. But it's a little too high res, right? This isn't really super great to work on. So then what I would do is I would come up to, and you can, once you Dynamesh it, go ahead and click this again so it's no longer active. The reason is because there's a hotkey in Zbrush for Dynameshing that once you've made an edit to your mesh, if you hold Control and drag off, it will re-Dynamesh your model again. So just keep that in mind. So once you've Dynameshed it, just go ahead and disable it so you don't accidentally Dynamesh your model again. And then I come down to ZRemesher, and then now I want to go ahead and bring it to a lower polygon count. So I'll go ZRemesher, we'll wait for it to go, I'm going to pause it. Okay, so this is pretty good. I had to do it again, but with a slightly higher count. I probably would do it higher still, because even though this is pretty good, and I'm just going to be, temporarily working on this isn't my final topology. Some areas down here are a little goofy, but that's okay. So what I want to do though is I kind of lost a lot of those forms and shapes, right? I kind of lost that shape. I lost like the hips. So this is very common, is what you do is you remesh your model. So you make it have like friendly topology, right? It's gonna be low poly topology. Technically I could take this out and bring it to Maya and it'd be totally okay. And then what I do is I give it a couple subdivision levels, and then jump back down to the lowest subdivision level. And then what I do is I project the details from my high poly version to my low poly version. So what I would do is I would go ahead and make them both visible at the same time. And I'm actually gonna, so they're both active and I've hidden everything else. And we're gonna use this thing right here called project. So project all. It's gonna essentially take our currently active subtool and it's gonna essentially shrink wrap it onto the other one. And so to do this, I'm going to also solo just so we don't have to see this version. We can see how well that projection is going. So now I come down here, click project all, right? So not a huge change, right? But you can see it's kind of snapping to the surface. I press D to go up a subdivision level, click project all again. And it's missing some things, right? So you can see it's missing the nose, so I probably have to bring that. Sometimes you actually have to, like if something's too far away, it might actually miss it. So I might bring this stuff up to there, and now we'll go ahead and project all. There you go. And then go up another subdivision level. You can see down here I'm getting a problem with the finger, so I would just go ahead and bring that part out too. And let's see, project all. And you would want to clean this stuff up as you're going along. So maybe I would use like an inflate brush to kind of maybe bring it a little bit higher on these guys to make them a little bit wider or larger. And let's go ahead and click on project all again. And so sometimes you have to kind of look and see, it looks like there's, yeah, this polygon in here. So let me just smooth that, project all again. There you go. Jump up another subdivision level, so maybe I have to add another one. And then let's do project all again. All right, and then this is kind of where I'm approaching the limits of the, capturing detail from my high res mesh to my low res mesh, right? So the reason why I do this is now I have this topology that works, right? It's pretty low poly for the most part. Like I have subdivision levels, so I can, work at high resolution. Oh, I have a problem there. So what am I? Oh, I should have checked that earlier, but there's like, when I was projecting it, I got kind of screwy right there. So I probably should have fixed that as I was going along. But anyways, I'm not gonna keep cleaning this up as I go. And then, at this point, it looks pretty close to this one, right? Some of these lines are missing, but for the most part, it's pretty good. If I wanted to, I can go one more subdivision levels. I'm now at 1 million, and I can go ahead and project all again. So let's go ahead and go to project all, and then I'm gonna get much cleaner kind of sharp lines right there. There we go. Okay, and then once I've done that, I can hide my old one or delete it. If it's looking good enough, I can get rid of the old stuff. And you'll see like those forms, some things need a little cleaning up, but like most of those forms like are almost indistinguishable, right? So that's the kind of the workflow we do is we make our model. Maybe it's like messy, maybe it's made of different pieces. Then if it's made of different pieces, we like kind of merge them together and weld them together. We use Dynamesh to combine them together. And then we use ZRemesher to make the topology lower and friendly. And then what we do is we add subdivision levels to this cleaned up, good topology version. And we project the details from the old high-res model onto this model with subdivision levels. And once I get to that stage, I can delete my old object. Okay, and then I just come in here and start cleaning things up. And like I said before, it's easier to smooth out. I'm just using a smooth brush. It's easier to smooth out at lower polygon or lower subdivision levels. And then I would use, just smooth this out. Maybe make sure I try the higher subdivision levels because there's still going to be, even though I smooth it out, if I go up to another subdivision level, there's a high frequency detail at that higher subdivision level I'm missing, right? And then, maybe I'll use an area or to kind of fill in a gap or fix up an area I might use, like maybe the clay brush with the lower Z intensity, right? So like, let's say back here, I might kind of close a gap. Like I might close this gap right here with that clay brush. So let's jump down a subdivision level. Something that's important with a lot of brushes I actually use really low Z intensities and let them build up over time, right? So you're gonna get much smoother surfaces and much smoother transitions by doing that. So I'll get rid of that and I'll start to start redefining things, right? So in this case, actually later on, you'll see that on my character I changed a lot about her. So, it's pretty easy to then go on to start moving things around and reshaping things, right? So if I come back over here, right, I just use that move brush and then jump to a lower subdivision level and move stuff around. Now is actually a good time for me to talk about the move gizmo. You can activate the move gizmo. I actually got rid of all the buttons for them because I just know the hotkeys. They're going to be like Maya, W, E, and R. You can press either of them. It's going to activate the gizmo tool. And so the gizmo tool is essentially going to let you move, right, rotate, and scale things. And this is where the masking is really important. So if I come over here to, not that one, I'm going to do mask lasso. So that lets me kind of like draw out a mask like that, an area to mask. And I'm going to invert it by control tapping the background. And I need to change the pivot point. So you can change the pivot point by holding Alt and moving it. So that moves the tool, this gizmo, without actually performing the operation. So you can see if I moved it, it would actually perform the move operation. But if I hold Alt or click on this little icon right here, it unlocks it. And I can hold Alt and just tap on the mesh, and that's going to reset the set the pivot point to be whatever I tapped on. So I hold Alt, and then let's go ahead and orient this like that. So what I could do is I can, scale something in, right? I can rotate things, move them up, right? So let's say I wanted her to have less of a pose and wanted her to have more of a T pose. I could do that, and then I'd come in here and clean up some areas. So clean that up. Something you might have seen me doing is let's go ahead and jump up a subdivision level and redefine that armpit. Okay, so something you might see me doing, and so I have transition also fill this in a little bit because it kind of lost a little volume, so I'm just using like a clay brush just to kind of fill that shape in. All right, so something you'll see me doing is changing the size of my brush pretty dynamically. I'm just pressing S on my keyboard to bring this up, and you let go. So that's just if you see me doing that. Let's say, for instance, I changed the shape of this quite a bit, right? So let's say, let's go up a subdivision level. Oh, let's clean that up a lot. Okay, so I'm gonna go up to this subdivision level, and let's say I wanted to like really define like a transition from a pectoralis muscle up onto the arm, right? Like that. I'm doing this really quick and goofy. So something like that. And I really want that topology to follow it, right? And this is not the best example because the topology is actually not the worst. But right, I kind of do that, or I make a really significant change on my model, right? So I added, like I did earlier, right? I just let's switch to move tool. Like I added horns, right? But the topology isn't supporting that, right? So if I come here, I have these really big stretched out polygons. So what I would probably want to do is do that workflow again, right? Duplicate my mesh. I'm going to remesh it. So in this case, I don't really have to do Dynamesh because I don't, I'm not welding pieces together, even though you can do, a lot of people do start with Dynamesh and then ZRemesher. But in this case, I'm just going to do ZRemesher and let it go. If I'm doing it at a higher poly count, it's going to take longer, so keep that in mind. Oh, I have a X symmetry on, so my symmetry's on. So just keep that in mind. If you want it to be symmetrical, make sure you have X symmetry on. You press X on your keyboard and make sure the X is highlighted. If you want it asymmetrical and you don't want it to mirror across, then make sure you turn off that symmetry. In this case, I do want that symmetry on there. So I'll go ahead and let that go. Here we go. Come on. There we go. Okay. And then I would do that same thing I did earlier, right? I make this subtool and this subtool active. In this case, this one's not symmetrical, so let's go ahead and I'm going to mirror and weld it. So I'll delete it, I'll go up a subdivision level, and I'm going to try to mirror and weld it, but you'll see modify topology, mirror and weld, says it can't do it because it has subdivision levels. I'll go ahead and delete all of the lower subdivision levels, so now it has no subdivision levels. And then I'm going to go ahead and click mirror and weld. So now it's kind of cut it in half, it flipped it across, and then stitched it back together. And so now I have my high res mesh, and then I have my low res mesh. And again, on this low res mesh, I'm just going to Control D to add subdivision levels, hold Shift D to go back down to my lowest subdivision level, and start projecting my detail on. And I just want to make sure, turn off solo. I just want to make sure that high res mesh is also active. So click on solo, project all, go up subdivision level, project all, go up subdivision level, project all. Once in a while, make sure I'm not missing any detail. Okay, go up a subdivision level, project all. And I keep doing that until I more or less recaptured exactly the model I have here. But then it has friendlier topology, right? You can see that actually, I mean, this isn't great topology because I have this weird spiral going on. But you can see that topology is actually supporting that shape as opposed to this one where it's, let's go ahead and go back here, right? It's not supporting that shape at all, right? It's just pulling it out of a grid, which isn't great. So this is going to be much nicer to sculpt on, right? I have the same level of detail that I can sculpt here versus here, right? Whereas on this one, you know, that, let's go up one subdivision level. That's pretty decent, but this is like way rougher. Okay, so that's pretty much the workflow. Once we're done with our mesh, there's a couple things we can do. We can, we would want to export a medium resolution version of our mesh because even though I did ZRemesher and this topology is okay, it's really not under my control. Like there's a lot of weird spots on here. There's like this really gross N-gon back here. This has a weird spiral to it, which is really annoying. So what I would want to do is I would want to kind of bring it into Maya to retopologize it. And I'm not going to go over that. the steps for actually doing the retopologies in Maya, but I would find like a good kind of medium kind of density. Like I maybe wouldn't go higher than like maybe 100,000 might be the tops I go, but I would do something like this. If you need more detail, like for instance, I was going to take this character out, right? And I was going to bring it over into Maya. I couldn't just use, this is a great example. Right, so this character's lowest is 28,000. This one's actually pretty good. I would probably export this one. But if you're like missing detail, then what you could do is, again, I'm going to kind of go through this really quickly, is you can go up to your high subdivision level. You see it's 1.8 million. That's not great, but I do want all these shapes, right? I want all those shapes that I had that I could see inside of Maya, or ZBrush. So what I would do is I would go up here to Z plugin, and I would click on this decimation master. What this does is it takes your model, it makes it into bad topology, but it's, so what I would do first is I would duplicate this, right? Because I'm going to be kind of messing it up, and hide the original. I might rename this, let's call this decimated. Right? And then I would come over here, Z plugin, pre-process it. So it's going to think about it. It's going to kind of analyze my mesh, see, just like get it kind of inside the buffer, so it knows exactly what the model's laid out, how it's laid out. Let me go ahead and skip forward. Okay, and then what we want to do is, and we'll take a look at the topology here. Let me go ahead and then we'll go to Z plugin, and then we're going to decimate. So we're going to get, we want to decimate down to 20% of its current polygon. So it's going to give me 20% of 1.8 million. So I decimate current, and then now it's down to 700. Or I can go even lower. So let's set that to like 3%. Now it's down to 100,000. And so, you know, obviously that topology looks terrible, but it actually looks and has all of the shapes and forms I need, right? Compared to my low poly. My low poly has really nice topology, or I mean, in this case it has nice topology, but you know, I'm losing a lot of the shapes, but by decimating a high res mesh, I actually create a mesh that has a lot of the same forms and details I need. And what this does is it acts as essentially a surface for us to draw our topology on. So here you can see they exported out a decimated or high res version of their mesh. Doesn't have the topology they want, right? And so what they do is they use it essentially as a snapping surface, and then they use a tool like Quad Draw within Maya to essentially draw out our topology of our low res model that has all the animation topology we really want. And then what they do is they go ahead and unwrap it. So you UV unwrap it like you would normal things, and then what you do is you want all of that detail on those sharp forms and those clean forms. You can see on this they have tons of wrinkles that they sculpted in, but obviously this low res mesh can't handle that. And so what we do is we bake that out as a texture map. So we take our low res mesh, we bring it in, and we bake the differences between the high res mesh and the low res mesh, and then you can load in that as a normal map or a height map inside of our 3D program, and you can bring it into Substance Painter, and you can see all those wrinkles are still there. This texturing job's pretty goofy, yeah, so we're just extracting the differences between those models. And so we have our high res stuff, we have our model that we retopologized and UV unwrapped inside of Maya, and so we're all cleaned up and we're ready to go. Like, everything's good to go. We got all our details from ZBrush, and so that's kind of the basic workflow, is going from sculpting simple forms and geometry and not worrying about topology, getting all our high-res detail in, and then going into Maya or any other program and redoing our topology so that we have nice layout for animation and rigging, and then we go ahead and unwrap it so we can start doing texturing, and then we bring our low-res mesh back into ZBrush. You can see they brought in the low-res mesh here, so you can see that this is the low-res mesh. Actually, I don't know if that is or not. And then they projected the details from that so they can get a height map or a normal map that we can use, get all that detail only as textures instead of as polygons. Cool. Hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have any questions about that, let me know. I've done this a couple times now, and so I'm pretty familiar with that whole workflow. The only thing, let me go ahead and actually talk about something here. The one thing I didn't talk about, I mean, there's a lot of things I didn't talk about. There's so much to cover inside here. But one of the things I didn't talk about was materials. So wherever you have your material at, that's usually like down here. I keep them. I usually have saved ones right here, but I have to redo my layout. If you click on that, if you're doing like a stylized character, I recommend this Zbrush Paint 2. So there's Zbrush Paint, right? Which actually this is a saved version of my Zbrush Paint. But the default Zbrush Paint, it's one you can download, or if you use my startup folder, you'll have it by default. It's really nice for stylized kind of skin. It has like a really nice, like compare that to the basic material. I use basic material most of the time to get like forms and shapes and volume. Like the shading on it looks really good. Like I can really tell like what the shape of a surface is by looking at it. Whereas the Zbrush Paint is probably going to give you a better idea of what your character might look like with like soft and gentle lighting. So there's Zbrush Paint, right, which is this one here. And let me go ahead and set these here. This might be easier. So Zbrush Paint and then Zbrush Paint 2. And so the Zbrush Paint 2 is actually a modification I made to it. So it's a little bit more like the basic material, and it also changes the color of the reflections, so they're not quite as bright and shiny, right? So it's a little bit softer. It's just a material I kind of like. And so that's usually where, as I'm getting towards the middle point, I'm starting to use like specific materials to kind of get a sense of what my character might look like. And some of these materials you can use like a light source with, right? So you can actually change the light source here, but not all materials. I think too often I see people use the default clay matte cap wax like this. It's my least favorite material. I'm not sure why people like it, but you'll see it's not really responsive to any light sources. So I usually just use my basic paint or basic material or the Zbrush Paint, and that way I can use the light source. And then we could even do things like rendering, and so that's just going to clean up the model, and that's just so you can kind of get a sense of what the final forms might look like with shadows, because you'll see like some areas aren't being blocked at all. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense.